Okay, so now I want to continue on to the final part of chapter 19, dealing with the Industrial Revolution. What is the Industrial Revolution? What was society like before the Industrial Revolution? It was predominantly a pre-industrial society. Most people lived on the land. It was a predominantly rural society. They lived in the countryside. The work that most people did and where most wealth was developed was in farming. Production was done in the home. The home was the main household, was the main economic unit. All members worked for the survival of the family. And everything was produced by hand. It was slow, time-consuming, expensive. But the Industrial Revolution changed all this. Manufacturing became mechanized. Things were now produced by machine, making it more quick, more efficient, and less expensive. The energy that propelled these machines were no longer human energy. It was no longer the hand pedal, the handle, or the foot pedal. It was now coal, steam, oil. And so now machines had a limitless source of energy. Production now was concentrated in the factory. People moved to the cities, and you had urbanization because they went to these factories to work. Now you see a transformation of national populations from more rural-based economies to urban-based economies. So how do you have an industrial revolution? Well, first you need an agricultural revolution, which took place in Britain in the 1700s. Why do you need an agricultural revolution? You need more food production. You need to feed this growing industrial workforce which is moving to the cities and working in the factories. But you also need money to invest in industrial development. So the farmers needed to make more money from farming in order to invest that extra money into new industrial technologies, machines. So how did they make more money on the same plot of land that led to the agricultural revolution, which ultimately meant a massive increase in how much food could be produced on the same plot of land? Farmers discovered, through the use of trial and error and scientific experimentation, that new crops could be planted, such as turnips, which did not exhaust the land, it refurbished the land. So now for the first time, you can continually farm on the same plot of land. You never had to let it rest fallow for a season in order to become re-nutrified. Farmers also discovered the use of fertilizer, horse and cow manure that was put into the soil, which would re-nutrify the soil. It was also discovered that if you enclose the land, you can put these techniques into practice on a large scale and make a lot of money. And as such, much of the common land was turned into private property at this time, and these technological innovations took place. Another thing that was needed for the Industrial Revolution was simply more people. People that would work the factories and people that would buy the goods. During this time, Europe had a population explosion. From 1700, in 1700, to roughly 120 million people, it jumped in 150 years to 260 million people, which is amazing. And the reason for this was people were simply living longer. They were healthier, there was less wars, less disease, more food. People were living longer. Now, Britain was the first industrial nation. And why is that? Part of the reason for Britain being the first industrial nation is because they had a large free trade area. What does that mean? It means you can buy anything and sell anything in any part of England and transport it over the whole country without having to pay a fee every time you move from one region to another. Moreover, England is a small island, relatively speaking, compared to the larger countries. It always had good roads, lots of rivers, lots of canals, making for cheap transportation. lots of coal and iron deposits, which was important because the coal powers the machines of the Industrial Revolution, and the iron is what you build the machines with. It also had sound banking, managed by the Bank of England, meaning the currency, the rates of exchange, loans were controlled by one central Bank of England. So you can always be guaranteed that your contract would never simply disappear or be changed because there was a currency problem, imbalance. Contracts would be enforced. England was also very politically stable because of its constitutional monarchy, and people are much more comfortable investing in a constitutional monarchy than in a place where there's always war and political trouble. And England was always a very mobile society. If you had money, you were respected in society. At this time, not many people respected wealth if it came from something other than land ownership. But in England, this wasn't the case. Wherever you got your wealth, you were respected, and this encouraged people to go into industry. Here's a map of Europe. You see England in the top left-hand corner, and as an island, it had far more advantages than France or Spain or Russia in terms of transportation and in terms of the ability to really have an industrial revolution before anybody else. The first industry that industrialized was the textile industry, the clothing industry. Part of the reason why it was the first is because the growing population demanded cheaper cotton products. And by that I'm talking about undergarments, shirts, suits, work clothes, formal clothes. These things, people wanted them made out of cotton, which was better than wool. It kept you warmer in the winter, cooler in the summer, and you could wash it over and over again. But cotton was expensive to make by hand. It had multiple stages. You had to pick and clean the cotton from the ground, spin it into thread, and then weave it into a fabric, all of which is done slowly and by hand. And so production was stuck, but there was a growing demand for cotton. And then in the 1700s, there was a series of technological breakthroughs which sped up the development of cotton. It began in the 1730s with James Kay, who invented the flying shuttle. This sped up the weaving part of the cotton production process, the making of the thread. Now that thread was being made more and more quickly, now that weaving was done more and more quickly, this is the weaving of thread into a fabric, the demand on thread increases. So that was met by James Hargreaves, who invented the spinning jenny in 1778. So now you have thread being made more and more quickly to meet the demand of those that weave the thread into fabric. The next stage was powering these machines by something other than foot pedals or handles. In the late 1700s, James Watt perfects the steam engine, which powers textile factories. In order to produce the steam, which powers these machines, you need coal. This steam engine revolutionized manufacturing, and it allowed for these machines to go on and on and on, and production went up and prices went down as a consequence. In 1792, Eli Whitney invented the cotton gin in America. This mechanized the cleaning process of cotton, and this had to happen because you needed this clean cotton to be given to the spinners who would turn it into thread. The reason why Eli Whitney is so important is because once the cleaning of cotton was mechanized, the only thing that was left over was the picking of cotton, and this was done by hand. And as cotton demand goes up, the demand for raw cotton also went up, which meant slavery in America, which people thought was on its way out, became much more entrenched because now you needed that slave labor to pick the raw cotton to feed the global demand for cotton. Here are pictures of the flying shuttle on the left and the spinning jenny on the right. Originally, these were powered by foot pedals and hand handles, but eventually these machines would be modernized, expanded, and mechanized and hooked up to steam engines. The next process, the next industry that was industrialized was coal production. Coal was needed to power the steam engines which would power the Industrial Revolution, the machines in the factories. The early steam-powered pumps allowed for deeper and deeper mines to be dug in order to get the coal out of the ground. And so what you had here is a cycle. The steam engine was developed. The steam engine could be hooked up to a pump, and so as you went digging for coal, the deeper you dug, the more water would fill up the mine, so you needed pumps to help you pump out that water. But now you had a steam engine, and you could use the coal that you dug out of the ground to power the steam pump to get the water out of the mine, and you just keep digging deeper and deeper, which means more coal can be pulled out of the ground, which means the price of coal goes down, and it further stimulates people to transition their manufacturing to steam power because coal is now cheaper and cheaper. The next and final industry that took off because of the mechanization of textile and then the greater production of coal was iron production. You needed the iron to power to build the machines of the expanding Industrial Revolution. But iron is expensive to produce. You need to get it out of the ground. You need to heat it and purify it in order to produce an iron which is clean enough to be melted into whatever piece you need to build a machine. In the 1700s, this became easier and easier to do. First of all, you could dig deeper and deeper because of the steam pump that allowed you to dig mines deeper and deeper. So now more iron ore is being pulled out of the ground. Secondly, in order to purify this iron, you no longer had to use wood, which was very expensive. Now you can use coal, which burned much more hot than wood, and especially coal powering a blast furnace was much hotter than anything people had ever used before, and it purified the iron much more quickly and cheaply than at any time in previous history. As a consequence, you have the demand for textiles, which drives the mechanization of the textile industry, the coal industry, and the iron industries. And now you have ripple effects to all other industries that want to expand, learning the lessons from textiles, but also having cheap coal and cheap iron to do so. All other industries started to mechanize now, production being concentrated in the factories, machines replacing hand production, coal, steam engine, and eventually oil, electricity replacing hand energy, hand power. Cities expanded as a consequence as more and more people moved to the cities to work in the factories. In 1500, there was only 156 cities with 10,000 or more people. By 1800, that number had grown to 363. Another consequence of the Industrial Revolution was the growth of a middle class, or what's known as the bourgeoisie. These were an economically powerful group that made their money from the Industrial Revolution, but they didn't have any political power. And this was the group that would push for more and more liberal reforms and democratization as the years would go by against absolute monarchs. And the final thing that developed was the beginnings of a class conflict. Artisans or skilled craftsmen resisted mechanization because machines were turning their skills into useless talent. because now they could be replaced by machines. They became angry. They resisted the Industrial Revolution, and the artisans were the basis of the future socialist movement and the organization of the working class against some of the greatest tragedies that resulted from the growth of the industrial capitalist market in the Western world.